Go back to your little workshop. Tomorrow, grown people are closing a real deal.
"12 hours after my wife's brother shoved me out of his father's house. He sat across from me in a glass boardroom and asked me for a job. The night before, Damian Carlton had called me a loser in front of my wife, his father, and a table full of investors. What he did not know was that by breakfast, the debt keeping his family's company alive would be controlled by me. 12 hours earlier, I had looked past Damian from the stone landing and found my wife. Yeah, frozen beside the dining room archway. She did not laugh with the guests. But she did not follow me either. 8 years of marriage stood between us. And in that moment, her silence felt less like neutrality than a decision she had not yet admitted making. Damian pointed toward the circular drive where my 12-year-old pickup sat between a Bentley and his new black Range Rover. "Go back to your little workshop," he said. "Tomorrow. Grown people are closing a real deal." I brushed dust from my jacket and gave him the only warning I could without violating a confidentiality agreement. "Read every page before you sign." What Damian did not know was that the little workshop he mocked was the original prototype lab of ForgeLine Systems, the industrial automation company I founded 16 years earlier. What he also did not know was that Hayes Industrial Trust, which I controlled, had quietly purchased the senior debt on Carlton Hospitality Furnishings 3 weeks before. By morning, his family's future would be sitting on my conference table. I did not tell him any of that. I stepped into the cold October air, walked past the valet stand, and climbed into the truck he hated seeing in family photographs. As I pulled away, I could still see Nia through the front windows. She had finally set down her glass. She was arguing with her brother. I wanted that to make me feel better. It did not. My connection to the company went back further than my marriage. My mother, Lenise Hayes, spent 19 years at Carlton plant, 3 sewing leather panels and correcting crooked seams before supervisors could see them. She raised me on overtime pay and packed my school lunches before dawn. The first computer I ever repaired sat in a dusty maintenance office 15 feet from her station. We married 3 years later. Nia knew I had founded ForgeLine and knew the company had done well. But she never cared about the number attached to it. Neither of us discussed my net worth with her family. After I stepped away from daily management to chair the trust, I started spending most mornings at the old prototype shop, mentoring apprentices and testing small manufacturing ideas. Damian decided that meant I had failed. To him, work counted only if strangers could see the title. When ForgeLine brought in a professional chief executive, he told people I had been pushed out. When I kept driving my old truck, he called me cheap. When I refused to invest in his restaurant concept, he started referring to me as Nia's charity project when he thought I could not hear him. The next line arrived when Carlton Furnishings began losing cash. Hotel orders had slowed. Raw material costs had risen. And 2 expensive expansions approved during the boom years were now draining the company. Vernon had suffered a mild stroke and stepped back. Nia became chief financial officer. Damian, 3 years younger and far louder, took over operations. Damian's answer was Sterling Crest Capital, a private equity firm promising an immediate cash infusion and a national distribution partnership. He presented the deal as salvation. The headline numbers looked generous. The footnotes did not. Sterling Crest would receive control rights after one missed covenant, the right to close plants without family approval, and priority over employee pension obligations. I read the draft because Nia asked me to. I circled 12 clauses, wrote 3 pages of questions, and told her the deal was not rescue capital. It was a transfer of control disguised as relief. Nia listened. Damian did not. He accused me of wanting the family company to fail so ForgeLine could buy its customers at a discount. That accusation changed the temperature of everything. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, Damian laughed and said I was sentimental because my mother had worked a sewing machine for Dad. I watched Nia's face change. She told him never to speak about my mother that way again. He apologized to her. Not to me. It was a small distinction. But I noticed it. People reveal hierarchy in the direction of their apologies. 2 days earlier, Carlton's primary lender had offered Hayes Industrial Trust a distressed block of senior debt under a written confidentiality agreement. Before our investment committee bid, I disclosed my marriage to Carlton's CFO, recused myself from pricing, and asked counsel Rachel Kim to document the conflict. I would control enforcement only after the purchase, under the same covenants as any creditor. Hayes Industrial Trust bought 68% of Carlton's senior secured notes. The purchase did not make me owner of the company. It made my trust the creditor with the strongest rights if Carlton breached its covenants. More importantly, it gave us access to financial reporting that Sterling Crest's presentation had conveniently softened. Carlton had only 23 days of unrestricted cash. That evening, she brought home a printed workbook. We sat at the kitchen island until after midnight. I never touched the pages because they were Carlton documents. But Nia described the assumptions aloud. Receivables were being collected in 29 days. Vendor rebates were arriving monthly. A large hotel customer had supposedly renewed early. None of those assumptions matched the operating patterns I knew. I asked who had built the model. Damian's new controller. Preston Vale, she said. I knew the name. Preston had been finance director at a forge line supplier 4 years earlier and resigned during an internal review of duplicate vendor payments. We had never accused him publicly of theft, but the review had found controls so weak that our suppliers board replaced the entire accounting team. The next morning, Nia requested underlying invoices for the vendor rebates. Damian refused, claiming operations needed 48 hours to compile them. That afternoon, he announced the Sterling Crest signing dinner at Vernon's house and invited lenders, advisors, and family members. The agreement was scheduled to be executed the next business morning. The dinner was meant to make the outcome feel inevitable. The dinner began with crystal glasses, expensive flowers, and a projection screen showing a rendering of Carlton's national future. Damian spoke for 20 minutes about scale, legacy, and the courage to stop protecting outdated facilities. Plant 3 appeared on one slide as a red box labeled non-core asset. No one said that 400 lives sat inside that red box. I asked Sterling Crest's managing director one question: whether the employee pension plan ranked ahead of the new acquisition debt if Plant 3 were closed. He gave a polished answer about comprehensive stakeholder solutions. I asked again. Before he could respond, Damian stood and told me the evening was for decision-makers, not retired software guys chasing relevance. Nia told him to sit down. Vernon asked everyone to calm themselves. Damian kept going. He said I had spent 8 years benefiting from his sister's success while pretending my hobby shop was a career. Then he looked at the guests and said, "Some men marry into a name because they could never build one." That was the moment the room stopped feeling like a dinner. I stood. Not because I wanted to fight him, but because I had learned long ago that remaining seated lets certain people confuse patience with permission. I told Damian the Sterling agreement contained a springing control clause tied to a covenant Carlton was likely to breach within a month, if he signed it without a verified cash forecast. He was not saving his father's company. He was giving it away. Damian walked around the table. Nia stepped between us. But Vernon told her not to make a scene in front of investors. Damian heard permission where his father intended restraint. He opened the front door, told me I was embarrassing the family, and ordered me out. I said I would leave. Then he shoved me anyway, because humiliation only works for men like Damian if witnesses can see it. I caught myself on the step and heard 2 people laugh from the dining room. I never learned which 2. I did not need to. The sound fixed the moment in my memory more clearly than their faces could have. Damian called me a loser. Nia said his name sharply. I looked at her, then at Vernon, and understood that no one in that house was going to undo what had just happened. So I left. In the truck, my hands stayed on the steering wheel for almost a full minute before I started the engine. I was not shaking from fear. I was controlling the kind of anger that makes simple answers feel righteous. One phone call could have frozen Carlton's accounts before midnight. Another could have told every person at that table who held their senior debt. I made neither call. Instead, I phoned Rachel and asked for the overnight covenant report. She reminded me that any enforcement decision required documented grounds and formal notice. Good, I said. Then we do this clean. I was not going to use creditor rights to punish my brother-in-law for insulting me. If Carlton was going to be stopped, it would be because the numbers demanded it. At 1:18 in the morning, Rachel emailed the report. Carlton had breached 2 reporting covenants and was within 48 hours of a minimum liquidity breach. The most serious problem was not the shortage itself. A certificate delivered to lenders 6 days earlier stated that unrestricted cash was nearly $4 million higher than the bank records showed. The certificate carried 2 electronic approvals: Damian Carlton, Chief Operating Officer, and Nia Carlton Hayes, Chief Financial Officer. I read my wife's name 3 times and felt the anger in me change shape. If she had falsified it, our marriage was facing one kind of ruin. If she had been used, it was another. I called and asked one question. Had she seen the bank statements herself? I asked whether she had seen the bank statements. She said no. I did not accuse her of fraud. I told her to preserve every email, text, draft, and attachment related to that certificate and not delete anything, even if it embarrassed her. She asked what I knew. I said, enough to believe tomorrow is not going to look the way your brother thinks it will. At 7:05 the next morning, Hayes Industrial Trust sent Carlton a formal notice of default and suspended consent for any new senior financing until the liquidity discrepancy could be explained. Sterling Crest's lawyers paused the signing within 11 minutes. By 8, the Carlton board had called an emergency meeting. By 8:30, Damian had started calling every lender contact he knew. At Noah, doisprezece. My assistant, Evelyn, stepped into the conference room at Forge Line headquarters and said there was a man downstairs insisting he needed to see whoever controlled Hayes Industrial Trust. He says it's urgent, she told me. I asked his name even though I already knew the answer. Damian Carlton. For the first time since the front steps, I almost smiled. When I opened the door, he was standing at the windows with his phone pressed to his ear. He turned, lowered it, and stared at me as though I had walked into the wrong room. What are you doing here? He asked. I closed the door behind me. You asked to meet the person who controls Hayes Industrial Trust, I said. You did. For several seconds, Damian said nothing. Then he laughed once. Too quickly. He said this was not the time for one of my jokes. I placed the debt purchase agreement on the table, opened to the signature page, and turned it toward him. Hayes Industrial Trust. Malcolm Hayes, Managing Trustee. His face changed before he finished reading the first line. He sat down without being invited. I remained standing. I explained that the trust held 68% of Carlton's senior debt and that the default notice had been issued because the company submitted a cash certificate inconsistent with verified bank balances. Damian told me the numbers were temporary. I asked why a temporary difference had been hidden by a $4 million adjustment. I told him the trust was willing to fund payroll and critical vendors for 30 days while an independent review took place. Plant closures would be prohibited during the review. He should have been relieved. Instead, he asked who would run operations if the board suspended him. That was when I understood why he had come so quickly. He was not only afraid of losing the deal. Damian leaned forward, fingers locked hard enough for his knuckles to pale. Malcolm, put me somewhere in Forge Line. Strategy. Operations. Acquisition, I don't care. Give me a job until this blows over. Less than 12 hours after shoving me out and calling me a loser. He was asking the man from the little workshop to protect his career. He still had not asked about one employee. I looked at him for a long moment. There are satisfying answers you imagine after someone humiliates you. Sharp lines. Public reversals. The kind of sentence people applaud in stories. What I felt in that room was quieter. I thought about my mother sewing seams at Plant 3 and about how many people were arriving there for a shift while Damian tried to save himself. I told him Forge Line did not create executive positions as shelters from accountability. If he wanted employment from any company I controlled, he would first cooperate with the review and explain every adjustment in Carlton's cash reports. His jaw tightened. "So this is revenge," he said. I shook my head. Revenge would be easy. Documentation is harder. He stood so quickly his chair rolled backward. He said my marriage would not survive what I was doing. That sentence told me he still believed Nia was leverage. I opened the door and asked Evelyn to escort him out. Damian stopped beside me and whispered, "She'll choose her family." I answered, "I hope she chooses the truth." Then I let him leave. At 10. The Carlton board formally delayed the Sterling Crest transaction. At 11. It retained an outside forensic accounting firm. At noon. Nia arrived at my office carrying a laptop and a banker box. She looked as though she had not slept. She set both on the table and said, "I approved a certificate I should not have approved. I need to know what my brother did." I told her the review had to answer that. Not me. She asked if I had bought the debt because I wanted control of Carlton. I said no. I showed her the bank's original sale process and the date our investment committee authorized the bid. Before I knew about Preston's spreadsheets and before the dinner, I also showed her the conflict memo documenting my family connection. Nia read every page. Then she asked the question I had known was coming. "Why didn't you tell me it was Carlton?" I explained the lender's confidentiality restriction. But I did not hide behind it. I told her I could have said more about how close the situation was once I realized the company was in danger. Even if I could not identify the debt, I protected the process. I said, "I did not protect us." Then I asked why she had not followed me outside. Nia stared at the table before answering. Vernon had looked unwell. The investors were watching, and she thought she could calm Damian first. I came out 3 minutes later. She said, "I remembered the cold stone under my palm and the sound of laughter behind the door." "For me," I said. Those 3 minutes contained 8 years of being told to absorb him. Nia's eyes filled. But this time she did not reach for an excuse. She said every holiday she had called my restraint maturity because that let her avoid confronting Damian. The shove was only the first time the cost became visible. "I failed you long before last night," she said. I answered, "Yes, the word hurt both of us, and neither of us tried to make it smaller." Then she opened the banker box. Inside were printed treasury reports, vendor ledgers, and a folder labeled Crescent Advisory. Nia said Damian had told her Crescent was a logistics consultant brought in to prepare the Sterling transition. She had approved 3 payments totaling $640,000 because the invoices were coded as restructuring expenses. Rachel searched the corporate registry while we sat there. Crescent Advisory had been formed 11 months earlier. Its registered agent shared an address with Preston Vale's brother-in-law. The bank account receiving Carlton's payments then sent recurring transfers to a holding company owned by Damian. The pattern was not proof of theft by itself, but it was enough to widen the review. Nia looked sick. She said she had challenged the 3rd invoice because there was no work product attached. Damian had sent her a deck 30 minutes later, and she approved it. I asked whether she still had the email. She did. The attachment metadata showed the deck had been created that same morning. Not over the 3 months of consulting work, the invoices claimed. The review team asked Nia to surrender her finance access pending investigation. She did it immediately. The board placed Damian and Preston on administrative leave. Vernon called me twice that afternoon. I let both calls go to voicemail. Not to punish him, but because I did not trust myself to speak to the man who had watched his son put hands on me and worried first about the investors. That evening I went to Plant 3. I had not been there after hours and years. The loading dock lights threw long rectangles across the pavement, and through the windows I could see the second shift moving between frames and fabric racks. My mother had spent almost half her adult life under those lights. The building was older, but the rhythm was the same. A supervisor named Rochelle recognized me from Forgeline's apprenticeship program. She asked whether the rumors about closure were true. I told her the deal had been paused and payroll funding was protected for the next month. She exhaled so hard it sounded like she had been holding that breath all day. Then she said, "My husband got laid off in June. This place is what we have." The forensic team worked through the night. By morning, they had identified 11 Crescent invoices. all approved through operations, totaling just over $9 million. Some carried Nia's secondary approval because policy required finance sign-off. None had credible deliverables. 3 payments moved within 48 hours into an entity that had paid Damian's personal credit line. The server audit showed how the false certificate had been built. Preston copied a prior template Nia had legitimately approved, replaced the cash schedule, and used her standing electronic workflow after Damian texted that Treasury had reconciled the figures. Nia's token had authenticated the approval, but access logs showed she never opened the replacement bank schedule. That explained the mechanism. It did not erase her duty to verify. That distinction mattered because the board needed truth, not a convenient villain. Nia had not created the false number or received money, but she had approved a lender certificate without reviewing the underlying bank statements. She had trusted her brother where her office required proof. When I explained what the logs showed, she said, "Put my failure in the report exactly as it happened." Then Sterling Crest sent a notice withdrawing from the transaction and blaming Carlton's internal control failures. Buried in the attachment was a side letter promising Damian a 2-year integration advisory role worth $750,000 after closing. The board had never seen it. Neither had Nia. The red box around Plant 3 suddenly had a price attached to the hand that drew it. Vernon came to my office the next morning without an appointment. At 71, he still dressed like every meeting might become a photograph. That day his tie was crooked. He sat where Damian had sat and stared at the city for a while before speaking. "I let my son turn my table into a courtroom," he said, "and I let you be the defendant." I told him the problem was larger than one dinner. Vernon had spent years praising Damian's confidence and treating Nia's caution as hesitation. He had given his son operational authority without insisting on the same controls he demanded from everyone else. When Damian insulted my work, Vernon called it personality. When he insulted my mother, Vernon called it family tension. Vernon looked older after I said it. He told me he had assumed my modesty meant my company had peaked and that I stayed around Carlton because being connected to his family gave me status. I asked him whether my bank account should have mattered to the way he let his son treat me. He looked down at his hands and said, "No, it was the right answer." Several years late, he asked whether Hayes Industrial Trust intended to take Carlton in foreclosure. I told him not if a workable restructuring could protect the plants and correct the governance failures. The trust was prepared to convert part of the debt into preferred equity, extend maturities, and provide a payroll line, but only if the board accepted independent oversight and removed anyone implicated in the vendor scheme. Vernon understood what that meant. "Damian is my son," he said. I answered, "And 412 people work at Plant 3. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had settled. "Do what protects the company," he said. I told him I would do what protected the people and let the company earn the right to survive. The audit committee meeting lasted 6 hours. Damian appeared by video with counsel. He denied taking money from Carlton and said the side agreement with Sterling Crest was standard compensation for transition expertise. Rachel asked why the agreement required him to support closing Plant 3. His lawyer objected to the characterization. Damian stopped looking into the camera. Preston broke when auditors placed 3 things beside one another: the file creation metadata, the Crescent Bank transfers, and his own messages from Damian ordering him to rebuild the deck after Nia questioned the invoices. He admitted backfilling consulting materials and inflating the cash forecast to prevent a lender default before closing. It was no longer inference. The instructions, timing, and money finally lined up. Damian called me 15 minutes after the vote. I let it ring once, then answered. He did not mention the dinner. He asked whether the forge line job was still possible. There was no irony in his voice, only panic. His lawyer had told him he needed income and a stable professional position. The man who had mocked my workshop now wanted it to become his shelter. I told him no executive role would be available. He asked about director, manager, consultant, anything. I said ForgeLine would not interfere with the investigation by employing someone whose conduct we were helping document. "So you get to destroy me and call it ethics?" he said. I answered. You are confusing consequences with an audience. Then Damian said, I have 2 kids. Malcolm. The anger in me thinned because they had nothing to do with Crescent. Sterling Crest, or the front steps. I told him I would pay their school directly through the semester and make sure groceries and health coverage were not interrupted. Protecting his children was not the same as protecting his reputation, and I wanted that boundary unmistakable. But I will not give you a title to make you look innocent. I said. Damian was quiet. He had spent years treating generosity as weakness because he only respected help when it came with status. I wanted him to understand the difference between protecting children and protecting a man's ego. Whether he understood it then, I could not tell. Nia moved into a furnished apartment near Carlton headquarters while the review continued. Neither of us used the word separation at first. But that was what it was. We spoke about documents, board meetings, and her father's health. We did not speak about coming home. Trust had not broken in one dramatic moment. The shove only made visible what had been cracking quietly. 3 days later, Nia asked to meet me at the old Forge Line prototype shop. She arrived before I did and was standing beside the first robotic arm I had built from salvaged components. The machine had not run in a decade. My mother's handwritten inventory labels were still taped inside a cabinet because I had never been able to throw them away. She apologized again, but differently. She did not say she had been trapped between husband and family. She said she had been afraid of humiliating Damian in front of investors. And in protecting him from embarrassment, she had allowed him to humiliate me. I chose the comfort of the room over your dignity, she said. That was precise enough to matter. I told her I could forgive a mistake faster than a pattern, and I needed to know whether she understood the pattern. She nodded. For years, she had asked me to absorb Damian's insults because confronting him made holidays difficult. She had called my patience maturity because that made her own avoidance sound harmless. I made your restraint pay for my peace, she said. Nia agreed. Then she handed me a resignation letter from Carlton. I told her not to resign, simply to prove something to me. She said it was not about our marriage. Her finance controls had failed, even if Damian manipulated them. And the company needed a CFO who could lead the restructuring without questions about divided loyalties. She would cooperate and leave when the board had a replacement. I respected that decision more than a dramatic sacrifice. She stayed for 6 weeks, documented every control weakness she had found, trained the interim finance team, and testified to the lenders about her approval failure. The board formally censured her for negligence but found no evidence she benefited from the Crescent payments. She accepted the finding without appeal. The restructuring plan came together slowly. Hayes Industrial Trust converted a portion of the senior debt into non-voting preferred shares, extended the remaining debt 5 years, and created a working capital facility tied to transparent weekly reporting. No plant could be closed for 18 months without approval from an independent workforce committee and the board. Plant 3 received capital for new cutting equipment instead of a closure notice. Forge Line donated not sold an updated scheduling system to reduce waste without reducing headcount. I insisted on the distinction because I did not want Carlton employees wondering whether I had engineered the crisis to create business for my own company. Every related party transaction would be published to the board. Rochelle was elected as one of 2 employee representatives to the new workforce committee. The day she heard, she called me from the loading dock. I have never been invited into a room where they decide whether my room gets to exist, she said. I told her that was exactly why she belonged there. Protecting workers without letting them speak for themselves is another kind of control. Vernon stepped down as chairman and became chairman emeritus with no operational authority. He did it publicly at the first employee town hall after the restructuring. He said the company had nearly lost itself because leadership confused loyalty with exemption from scrutiny. He did not name Damian. He did not need to. Everyone in the room understood. Then Vernon did something I did not expect. He told the employees that Lenice Hayes had worked at Plant 3 for 19 years and that her son had helped keep the doors open when his own family had failed to see his value. I stood at the side of the stage wishing he had left my name out of it. But when the plant workers applauded, I thought of my mother and let the moment stay. Damian was referred to state investigators along with the Crescent records. The process would take months, and I refused to predict its outcome. The board pursued civil recovery of the consulting payments. Damian sold the Range Rover and listed his lake house. For the first time since I had known him, the symbols he used to measure himself were disappearing faster than he could replace them. He came to the prototype shop one rainy afternoon without calling. Evelyn had told reception not to block family members unless I asked, and I had not. Damian stood just inside the doorway wearing a plain navy jacket. There was no lawyer, no watch I recognized, no performance. He looked at the scuffed floor and said, "So this is the place I made fun of." I told him Nia knew Forgeline was successful. What the family did not know was how much equity I kept and how the trust was structured. But none of that changes what you did. I said, "If I had lost every dollar 5 years ago, you still would not have had the right to treat me like I was less than you." He nodded once, eyes still on the photograph. Then he asked for a job again. This time he did not ask for strategy or acquisitions. He said, "Anything. Warehouse. Shipping. I need to work." I told him the active investigation made Forgeline employment inappropriate. But I knew a packaging cooperative across town that hired people with operations experience and did not care about titles. His face tightened at the word cooperative. I could see the old Damian fighting the new circumstances. I gave him the manager's name and told him I had not called ahead and would not. If he wanted the job, he would apply like everyone else. He took the card. "Will you tell them who I am?" he asked. "Only if they ask me for a reference," I said. Damian looked at the card for a long time. Then he said, "I was wrong about you." It was the apology of a man who had not yet learned how to say what he was sorry for. I did not reward it with forgiveness he had not earned. I said, "You were wrong about what makes a person valuable." He put the card in his pocket and left. Damian got the job as a shift coordinator, not a manager. Nia told me later that he almost refused when he heard the title. Then he looked at his children and accepted. For the first month, he worked from 2 in the afternoon until 11 at night, checking pallets, resolving driver issues, and learning the names of people he once would have called labor. Nia and I were still living separately. We had started counseling, not because a therapist could erase the dinner, but because both of us needed a place where family loyalty could not dominate the conversation. She had taken a finance role at a nonprofit housing developer, earning less money and sleeping better. For the first time in years, her job did not share a wall with her father. 6 months after the dinner, the Carlton board released its first restructuring report. Cash flow had stabilized. Customer cancellations were lower than forecast. Plant 3 had won 2 new hotel contracts because the workforce committee proposed a shorter custom production cycle. The previous leadership had never asked them to design. The people marked non-core had found the growth plan. On the anniversary of my mother's death, I went to Plant 3 before sunrise. Rochelle met me near the sewing line and showed me a small brass plaque the workforce committee had installed without telling me. It carried Lanice Hayes' name and one sentence from an old training note she used to repeat. "Do the hidden seem right? Someone will depend on it holding." I ran my thumb over the letters and had to look away. For months, people had thanked me for saving the plant. Standing there, I understood how backward that was. That plant had fed me, educated me, and given my mother dignity when we had very little else. Protecting it was not charity. It was repayment on a debt no trust document could measure. I told her the same was true for us. The marriage had not been endangered because her brother disliked me. It had been endangered because we had built a habit where I endured disrespect and she managed the discomfort around it. We could not change Damian's character for 8 years in the past. We could change what our home required from this point forward. A month later, I moved 1 suitcase back into our house. Not all of them. We agreed that rebuilding should look like rebuilding, not pretending the structure had never been damaged. Nia laughed when she saw the single suitcase and said it was the least romantic homecoming she had ever imagined. I told her romance had been overrated lately. She laughed harder. The first family dinner after that was small. Vernon. Yeah. Me. Damian. His children. And no investors. We ate at the same long table where he had called me a loser. No one mentioned the Range Rover that was gone or the deal that never closed. Halfway through dinner, Damian set down his fork and asked if he could say something before dessert. At the next small family dinner, Damian apologized in front of Vernon and Nia without asking for a shortcut back to normal. He named the workshop jokes, the insult to my mother, the pressure he put on Nia, the shove, and the fact that his first request the next morning had been for a title rather than help for the workers. For once, he described the harm before describing what it had cost him. I told him I accepted the apology. I did not tell him the past disappeared. Forgiveness is not an invoice marked paid. It is a decision about what you will carry into the next room. Damian nodded and asked whether he could help clear the table. Vernon nearly smiled into his napkin. Nia reached under the table and rested her hand against mine. After dinner, I stepped onto the same stone landing where I had caught myself months earlier. The night was warmer. My truck was still in the circular drive. Although the Bentley had been sold as part of Vernon's retirement plan, Damian came outside carrying a bag of trash and stopped beside me. "You could have destroyed me that morning," he said. I told him yes. Hayes Industrial Trust had enough leverage to force a liquidation that would have wiped out the Carlton family's equity. "Why didn't you?" he asked. I looked toward the windows where his children were helping Nia stack plates. "Because the company was never just yours," I said, "and neither were the consequences. Real power was narrower and more demanding. It was having the ability to retaliate and still choosing a process that protected people who had nothing to do with your humiliation. It was telling the truth when the truth cost your own family. It was refusing to turn someone's children into collateral even when their father had tried to use your marriage as leverage." I smiled at the thought. Not because I had proven I was richer than he imagined. That would have been the smallest victory available. I had proven something to myself instead. I could be humiliated without becoming cruel, angry without becoming reckless, and powerful without needing anyone else to kneel. Those were harder things to build than a company. At 9, a group of apprentices arrived for the Saturday program. One of them pointed at the old robotic arm and asked why we kept a machine that no longer worked. I told him because it reminded us that useful things can look unimpressive before people understand what they are becoming. He nodded like he was not sure whether I was talking about machines. Maybe I was not. My mother had spent years making hidden seams no hotel guest would ever see. Forge line began in a room most executives would have called a garage. Plant 3 survived because workers the old board had labeled non-core knew how to redesign production better than the consultants. Value has a habit of hiding where pride refuses to look. And that is why the sentence Damian threw at me on those stone steps never became the sentence that defined me. Loser was only a word spoken by a man who had confused appearance with worth. By the next morning, he was asking me for a job. Months later, he was finally learning why having one mattered. I did not save Carlton Furnishings to win an argument with my wife's brother. I saved what could still be saved because 4 plants, hundreds of families, a marriage, and even a flawed man were bigger than one ugly night. Some doors close because you are being rejected. Others close behind you because you are being given the distance to decide what kind of person will walk back through them. When I returned to Vernon's house, I did not enter as the secret creditor who could crush the family or the founder Damian had failed to recognize. I entered as Malcolm Hayes, Lenice's son, Nia's husband, and a man who finally understood that respect built on hidden wealth is not respect at all. If people only value you after learning what you own, they have told you exactly what their judgment is worth. The stone step was still there. So was the door. But the next time Damian held it open for me, neither of us pretended the gesture erased the past. It meant something simpler. He had learned that pushing a man out of a room does not make him smaller. And I had learned that being able to push back does not always mean you should. That was enough for me. Not a perfect family. Not a perfect ending. Just a company still running. Workers still paid. A marriage rebuilding on better rules. And a brother-in-law earning his way back one shift at a time. The things worth keeping had survived because, for once, we stopped protecting pride and started protecting what pride had almost destroyed.